there wasn't a lot of people who were into extreme metal or underground metal. And so for that, I guess, yes, maybe I can take some credit. But at the same time, is these bands are still around today, still making music, still touring, still doing quite well. Some, arguably some are doing better than they were. And so I think you have to say is those bands were great, and I was lucky to be a part.
to help their escape. An easy way out is what they create. Claiming the same as a way to freedom. People are stupid enough to believe them. Death and life taken so easily. Right or wrong, whose choice will it be? Abortion when it is needed. Execution for those that deserve it. The giving and taking of life will always be.
Welcome to episode 300 of the Dreams of Consciousness podcast. If you gentlemen would be so kind, would you mind introducing yourselves?
Hello, I am David E. Gehlke, author of the new Scott Burns Sessions, A Life in Death Metal, 1987 to 1997.
Hi, I'm Scott Burns, and I'm David's buddy, and he wrote the book, and yeah, Adrian, thanks. We're going to talk about it.
Thank you guys for joining me for this very special episode. We'll start with David. In addition to writing this book with Scott, about Scott, you've also written a number of books in the last few years about Paradise Lost, Obituary, Noise Records. You're also a contributor to Decibel magazine, and I believe in the past you worked for Metal Maniacs, right?
Correct. Right now, I do most of my work for Blabbermouth, actually, but yes, Scott's book is my fourth. Yes.
Okay. And if anybody listening to this podcast does not know who Scott Burns is, I think you should go. I think you're in the wrong place. Just a little bit of backstory. You know, Scott asked me to tell him a little bit about myself before we started. And, you know, for me, it starts in 94 when I heard a band from Brazil called Sepultura for the first time. And they quickly became my favorite band. And in tracking down their earlier albums, I got Beneath the Remains and Arise, and it led me down a path to, you know, much heavier, much more underground music. Scott, tell me if any of these bands sound familiar to you. Obituary, Cannibal Corpse, Napalm Death, Gorguts. Are you familiar with any of these bands, Scott?
I am. They were awesome, and I am lucky enough that they came and recorded with me back in the, you know, late 80s, early 90s, and yeah, they were killer, and yes, they were great bands, and the greatness of them is they're still around today even without me. So it just proves that they were really great bands that have nothing to do with me, but I was lucky enough to record them. So yes.
Well, I think as David can attest to, Scott is being incredibly humble right now.
No.
I would make the argument that they are around today because of you and because of the work that you did on those albums.
If you buy David's book, I was lucky enough to record a lot of bands, a lot of great bands, a lot of good bands, and a lot of bands that still aren't around. And I love them all. They're like my kids. But I will say this is, honestly, Adrian, that those bands are still great because they are great. Did I contribute in the beginning? We can talk about that. Like, most people thought death metal was shit back in the day.
Oh, I remember.
So I get that. And they weren't into it.
Did you ask if it was okay? Did you ask if it was okay to swear on this, Scott?
Sorry, David. Yeah, is that okay?
I don't think Adrian minds.
I believe Chuck Schuldiner had a catchphrase, right? Let it ride, metal brother.
Yeah, that's right.
Let it flow, metal brother. Let it flow, right? That's what he said to Scott all the time.
Metal brother, let it flow.
Yeah.
Okay, that's my philosophy, Scott. Let it flow.
Yeah. No, I mean, listen. I think I helped them in the beginning, like I said, but the main thing back in the day was, there wasn't a lot of people who were into extreme metal or underground metal. And so for that, I guess, yes, maybe I can take some credit. But at the same time, these bands are still around today, still making music, still touring, still doing quite well. Some, arguably some are doing better than they were. And so I think you have to say those bands were great, and I was lucky to be a part of
To counterpoint, I butt in is, sort of what Adrian was going back to is that the combination of the songs, which Scott is definitely right about, a lot of those bands in the early days wrote great songs, but it took a special sort of engineer, and Scott will definitely hit upon this soon, as will I, was a great studio as well, which was more a sound recording. And without all of those things, it was sort of like convergence of all these great things happening at once. It was like lightning in a bottle. It's probably something we will never see again. There will likely never be a studio that was ground zero for all these things happening for a style of music, and a producer like Scott and a group of engineers like the Morris brothers or Rick Miller. They're building the technology and helping the bands and helping Scott along the way. All those things led to those albums that Adrian, you had mentioned, by Sepultura, Obituary, Death, Cannibal Corpse, Napalm. That's what helped make them all legendary. And because they were all so great early on, that's what helped prolong their careers.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely, David. And to chime in on that is that, back in the day, and you touch upon it in the book, is that, look, most of the stuff, once you got really fast, Jim, Tom, and Rick, and we can, listen, I didn't record them, Tom did, but you can throw in there Morbid Angel. So you really cover, like, most of the great death metal bands, right? And he did them. But like I said, they built that studio, and, and Dan Johnson, like you touch upon in the book, with the Whiplash, Damage, Sabotage, obviously Nasty Savage was around, but there was, Jim and Tom and Rick built something where there was a great studio. And once again, like I said, in the book, we talk about, like, I went to other studios, they all sucked. But that really helped because, the old records, nothing to say anything against them, great records, but, Possessed, or even the first, Scream Bloody Gore. Nothing against Randy. It sounded better, but not great. But, Dark, a lot of that stuff didn't sound that good. As far as what, production wise, what I considered like were great sounding metal records or great sounding rock records where it had great production. And I think for the death metal guys, I was young enough, came from the punk background, is that a lot of people just blew it off and said it's fast, it's fucking, the vocals are fucking some dog barking, and they blew it off. But like I said, as David said, is that, it was, convergence of the studio, I guess me, because I was younger and I was into extreme stuff. Like I said, Jim, Tom, and Rick, and throw in there Dan Johnson. It was the perfect storm or whatever, as you say, but that's it.
I want to talk a little bit about how the two of you first got in touch and decided to collaborate on this book.
Yeah, I can go because Adrian, what Scott did to you when we kicked off this call is basically what he did to me when we were doing the Obituary book. So when I was asked...
People listening to this podcast won't hear the exchange that I had with Scott, but Scott inquired to my background and about myself for a bit before we actually started the podcast. I think, David, in the book you mentioned that Scott throws interviewers off by asking them about themselves, which is definitely a change of...
Yep, it's a Scott Burns trademark. Yeah. So when I was asked to do the obituary book a few years ago, Scott, of course, is one of the main interview subjects. And the first time Scott and I spoke, he started asking me, barely a minute into it, started asking me those questions. David, what do you do? David, where do you live? David, what do you like to do? David, tell me about your family. And so we started off on that foot. And it turns out Scott and I are aligned in a lot of things outside of music too, which certainly helps our conversations. I think we are aligned from a belief system level and from a lot of other things too. So I think we sort of hit it off from that standpoint. And from there, and Scott, correct me if I'm wrong, I think you and I spoke at least 3 or 4 times about Obituary. And maybe for a fraction of those calls, we just didn't even talk about Obituary. We just talked. And so that's Scott and I built a pretty immediate rapport. And so from there, once the Obituary book wrapped, Scott had been approached by Tim Hubbard, to which this book really may not have been possible without, because Tim was the go-to photographer back in the late 80s, early 90s for all the labels. There were no quote unquote death metal photographers back then. Tim was the guy, and Tim and Scott go way back through high school. And when a band would come down and say Monty Connor from Roadrunner would need a photo session, Monty would ask Scott. Scott would say, hey, I have my buddy Tim. Tim could shoot you guys and he could do a great job and it won't be very expensive. So voila, like all those great pictures you see of Deicide and Obituary and Death and Sepultura, that was Tim Hubbard. So Tim had approached Scott about doing a book about Scott's recollections from that era combined with his pictures. And lo and behold, the Obituary book is a wrap. And Scott hits me up probably a little bit after I had turned it in and said, hey, I'm thinking about doing a book. Would you be interested in helping me? And of course I said yes, based on the fact Scott and I had hit it off so well and he seemed like an easy guy to work with. And then Scott my first thought was, okay, we'll just go with all the huge bands that Scott did, the bands everyone knows about, the bands Adrian, you had mentioned, the Deaths, Cannibal Corpse, Obituary, Suffocations. Then Scott turns around and goes, no, if we're going to do a book, and this is the famous line that he gave me, I don't want to be that guy walking down the street and have one of my bands who I record and say, hey, Scott, I see there's a book about you, but my band's not in it. How come? And, to Scott, that would be a terrible thing to happen. So Scott had politely requested that I try and track down every band that he recorded. And so I think in the book we have 69 bands, I want to say, but if the unofficial count of Scott Burns' projects may be anywhere from 80 to 90 or possibly even 100 bands that he did over time. So that's sort of, and I took it on as a challenge. It's like, there are not too many books like this, right? There are not that many books told from, it's really an oral history, right? It's not told from my standpoint. It's told from Scott and his band's standpoint. I thought that made it sort of a unique twist on the book. And so once we had sort of figured out what the format would be, and we had Tim's photographs to help us along and the support of Decibel, we were off and running. I think we started probably 2 years ago around this time, I want to say.
So, Scott,
Yeah.
why David? Why was David the guy to do this book?
No, like you said, David was cool. And we talked, we spent a lot, as he said, we would talk about Obituary. And I love those guys. I mean, you can read his book, you can read his book about it. When they started out, they were like 15 years old, and I knew them, and I was older, and blah, blah, blah. But so they were near and dear to my heart. And he called to interview about it. And, we just talked. And like I said, we had a good rapport just about life in general and in the band. So, I mean, it was just a nice, easy flowing conversation, as he said. So he mentioned Tim, my buddy, we had punk rock background and stuff. He took, I remember like with Obituary, I told him, I said, Tim, because we came from more of a punk background, Exploited, UK Subs, Crass, whatever. But, I mean, old school hard rock and metal, but we were kids. But I was like, dude, you got to hear this John Tardy guy. He's the fucking craziest guy I've ever heard in my life. And that's how we ended up doing, it's how we ended up doing Slowly We Rot. And then, as David said, all the stuff with him taking a bunch of photos. But one day he was like I said, is during all that, he was like, we should do a photo book, a book about all the bands you did. And then we talked about it and stuff. And, it probably, then the realization was like, we're not really, Tim's a great photographer. I just happened to be there. And so, but we really need to get a professional. And like David said, so I just said after the thing, hey, would you be interested in telling a story about the bands? And I think the thing is David did a wonderful job because it was important for me. A lot of the bands, like I said, some of them have rose to more fame than others, but they're all equally important. I mean, they're just a part of the scene and the history, and that's the beauty of it. And, he did yeoman's work of going out and finding all these bands. He found, to be honest, bands that, through 30 years, that some of them, it's like, I was like, wow, I forgot I recorded them. And, and I don't mean that to sound bad, but at the same time, is sometimes you only spend a couple days with somebody. But they were all equally important. And I never, as he said, I never wanted it to feel like, hey, you only did like the big, Death or Obituary, Deicide, Cannibal Corpse, Atheist, Napalm, whoever. All the bands, they were great bands. Some of them, for whatever reason, some of them around, some of them aren't around. And David went out and found all them bands and talked to them and did it. And I think the important thing is it gives a good, history of the scene back in the day. Because, one thing, David and I would talk about is that it's much different nowadays. Death metal is not just death metal. People just talk about it as metal. But back in the day, it wasn't cool unless you were in the underground. And I mean, you know what I mean? It was popular and everything, but at the same time, it's different. Now today, everything's accepted. Like you can sing like Barnes, you can sing like Deeps, any of the bands, and they're huge, they're big. But back in the day, it wasn't like that. So it was nice that he brought up all the bands, and I appreciated it because, like I said, to me they were all good bands, and I had fun, and I'm just happy to be a part.
As David mentioned, this is an oral history, and you guys got a lot of the bands featured in the book to to contribute their memories of these sessions. But I think, David, you also provide important context to what was going on in the larger metal world.
Absolutely.
Yeah, in terms of like, you know, in the early 90s, technicality and speed became very, very important. And those were, you know, the driving factors behind a lot of these bands. And, you know, as some bands started getting more popular and started moving in a slower, more groovy direction, you see that kind of start to rub off on these death metal bands as well.
Yeah, I mean, and Scott had a front row seat to all this, but once the 80s started to flip over to the 90s and thrash was on its way out there, it's sort of funny because thrash was always the more technical style of music, right? If you think of what was happening
Yeah, absolutely.
with bands like Watchtower and Corner, and I mean, you could definitely make the argument, you know, Megadeth was pretty technical too, right? Even though they were largely a very popular band. But once we got into probably 1991, Scott, that's when everyone wanted to be really technical, and it was sort of driven by, and they were really underappreciated at the time, but it was really driven by Atheist and Cynic, because those two bands could run circles around, technically, at least a lot of the other bands. And once bands started realizing, hey, this guy is really good on the drums, or look at this guy play all these licks on the guitar, everyone wanted to get better, which as a result of everyone wanting to get better on their instruments resulted in everyone wanting to write better songs, which also meant, if you look at it this way too, it meant they needed better production values, which is where, you know, Scott came in handy. And since Scott sort of had a knack for capturing bands who could play technical and brutally at the same time, that's sort of what helped all those productions there. It's interesting because everyone thinks like Death's Human, which came out in 1991, is like the beginning of technical death metal, but it was already, the scene was long in motion with Atheist and Cynic when they were death metal bands before then. But that's just widely considered the most technical. Human, I should say, is widely considered to be one of the most popular technical death metal albums, but in reality, the scene was already going well before then. So yeah, and then then once you get further into like the mid 90s, that's when like the groove metal stuff starts coming in. And like, even look at Obituary for World Demise, that's a very groovy album, if you want to say. It's almost modern sometimes. You know, that stuff is very popular. And so yeah, I mean, death metal, unfortunately, to use a pun here, cannibalized itself by the mid 90s, because you had all these bands who were, you know, Scott said it all the time, a imitation of an imitation of an imitation, right? You had all these third or fourth rate bands showing up at Morrisound, demanding that Scott get them to sound like Suffocation or Chris Barnes, and Scott would turn around and say, look, there's only one Chris Barnes, there's only one Frank Mullen. I can help you sound good, but I can't get you to sound like those guys. And I think that's probably when Scott, please feel free to chime in, you knew the scene was in trouble probably around 93 or 94 when all the clones started coming in.
Yeah, I mean, sure. Yeah. But yes, absolutely, David. You know, well said. But I mean, I guess if you go back to, like you said, the beginning of what you're talking about with the thrash and being technical is, I think, you know, for us on the death metal side is that, you know, and then you point to Human too, is that, you know, sure, Human, you know, to touch on that, you know, everybody talks about it as the best. And I mean, look, Sean Reiner, Steve DiGiorgio, Chuck, I mean, Paul, I mean, what can you say? But at the same time there was the Cynic guys, everybody was doing stuff. And the most, you said, going back to the Morrisound, talking about the studio, is that was the thing, is like, nobody wanted to hear the bass drums just being a bunch of rumble or the blast. They wanted to really hear if the guy was cheating or if he really could play and stuff like that. And that was the big deal, was to go into the studio and to try and record that and get it crystal clear, and to see if they were cheating or if they were really playing it, if they really had chops. And like I said, with the technical stuff, I mean, look at, like you mentioned, David, going from Spiritual to Human, right? I mean, Spiritual's a great album, but it was still back in the old school with Chuck, Billy, and Terry. And then by the, I mean, Chuck had some lineup changes, as always, well documented, but you could see the whole scene changing. And I mean, sorry, to jump back even further is, to the thrash aspect, when you take it back to the Tampa scene, is look at Nasty Savage. They were technical as fuck. Dave, Ben, Curtis. But then you had Ronnie's vocals. They were King Diamond style. And even, Slagle had signed them and they were popular. But, Executioner guys, Atheists, all the bands started death metal stuff, Chuck. The kids started to just really turn. And I mean, like I said, I'm not saying what's right or wrong. Savage is one of the most influential Tampa bands there are, like with Sabotage. But, the scene started to change and everybody liked the brutal vocals, right? The heavy stuff. And that's what was surprising because, like I said, is a lot of the guys back in the day that were outside death metal, because I would record thrash metal or metal bands would come into the studio with Jim, Tom, whoever. They would all talk about it as a passing phase. Oh, it's Cookie Monster, it's blah, blah, blah. And look at where we are today in 2023. Nobody says anything about a guy that sounds deep. So, but I think your points are well taken, David, that's all true, that, you know what I mean, how it really started to turn.
Reading this book at times was like, watching a movie like Boogie Nights or Goodfellas, where, the director would put in certain cues that a shift was about to happen, like the era is about to change. Throughout the first part of the book, an album that keeps coming up is Rain and Blood. And I think that informed a lot of what the death metal bands of the time were doing. And then, innocuously, at some point in the book, the bands are discussing Metallica's Black Album. And, it almost takes on this like ominous note if you understand like the significance of what was about to happen. It was like, the asteroid has emerged on the horizon, and metal's about to metal's about to be wiped out for the next decade. Scott, as these things were happening, I guess first of all, were you aware of like a lot of what was being released in terms of like, grunge albums, and later on, the big four turning more commercial, and finding like, alt rock, punk rock, stuff like that? And did you have an inkling that maybe things were about to change for the death metal scene as well?
Well, I mean, I don't know if I'm following Adrian, but I mean, I think David talks about it, like, Frank, Trevor from Obituary. Like, we used to listen to Smashing Pumpkins and Nirvana and stuff when they first came out. So, and Pearl Jam or whatever, but, it's different stuff. But as far as like, if you're saying like with death metal, I guess the biggest thing, is that no one liked the vocals, right? I mean, like, it was a no-go, showstopper, whatever. Like, you either were into thrash and you liked, the high vocals or whatever, but at the time, if you like Mullen or Barnes or Glenn, or you picked your singer as, no, nobody liked it. It was purely underground. Now, was it popular? I guess yes, it was to a certain degree. Absolutely. I mean, these bands got signed. Monty spent a lot of money. Slagle, Digby, whatever. But at the same time, it was underground. I mean, when you talk about, like you said, Slayer, Anthrax, Overkill, those guys were the big bands. Whoever, Testament, we were just shit. And I don't mean to say we were shit, but I meant is like, it was still underground. There was no, I mean, I think Roadrunner, all them, they had dreams of these guys being big. And like I said, Sepultura came the closest commercial success-wise or whatever, and all labels think their bands are going to be big. But I don't know. I think that it was a long time. As far as in my career is, we were never considered, to be big as far as compared to the big thrash bands.
But in terms of like the stylistic shifts, because you did notice the clone bands starting to come in around like 93, 94. And so I think you had
Oh, absolutely. You could pick the Morbid Angel. You could pick the Deicide riff, the Obituary riff, name the band, Cannibal Corpse riff. Absolutely. I mean, but I think to go to it, and David, we talked about it, and David can chime in, is that a lot of the labels started signing everything that could move because they could make enough money on these bands. You go to finances, these records were done cheaply, right? I didn't make a lot of money. They didn't give the bands a lot of money. But business-wise, business is business. They figured out they could sell X amount of units. They spend this much money, whatever, and they would, and these bands underground, they did well. Like I said, they all did well in the underground, and they would try and throw stuff against the wall and see if it would stick. And so, like I said, but eventually, like David just said, is that they became clones of, some bands became clones of clones, but, and I think that was the end of it. But
well, Scott, I think you knew the scene was in trouble probably around 94 when you usually would get bookings well in advance. You were so far booked up in some years that you had no availability on your calendar. And then once you saw probably around 94, 95, 96, that less bands were starting to come in or other bands started going elsewhere. And well, I don't know if Adrian, you want to get into this, but labels were wary of using Scott because they didn't want the quote unquote Scott Burns sound. And so the money eventually started drying up. Bands started going elsewhere, and death metal really wasn't that hip anymore by the mid '90s because new metal had come in and black metal was getting really big. So
Absolutely.
that, I think, a lot of those things led to, and Scott, in his defense, was doing countless albums a year and was getting burnt out by it. So I think all those things really brought things to a head for Scott.
Yeah, like who's our buddy, the Swedish? Sorry, forgive me.
Thomas Skogsberg.
Thomas Skogsberg.
No, yeah, but the band, the black metal band. You know what I mean? I mean, Dan
Swano. Yeah, Dan Swano had the same experience as you. Yeah, he had his own studio. He did a few popular black metal albums. Dissection and Marduk and Diabolical Masquerade and Catatonia, and bands wanted to come and record with him, and he lived sort of the same life as Scott, never leaving the studio, working 18-hour days. Working 18-hour days is okay, but you're not making any money, right? Swano didn't make any money. Scott didn't make any money. And at some point you're just burnt, and Scott can definitely attest to this. No one was more burnt on death metal than him by the mid '90s.
Yeah, but no, I was going to point out to what you put in the book, the Swedish guys, the black metal band that were so prophetic. I mean, I think they hit the nail on the head. Dan Seagrave, Roadrunner, Scott Burns. Who was
Mayhem, the Norwegians. Yeah.
So let's talk about that. In the early '90s, when Euronymous was releasing albums through his imprint, he would put a little sticker on the back of his albums, which in some ways was a parody of what Roadrunner had on their albums, which was "Stop the Madness," right? Don't do drugs.
Yeah, for drugs, right? Yeah, drugs are no fun. Yep.
Except for Euronymous, it was "Stop Scott Burns," and it became the meme. What was it? No mosh, no fun, no trend, no core.
There it is. Yep.
Yeah, and it was a picture of Scott with in like a stop sign, which I think even as a teenager at the time, and Scott, maybe you can tell us about your feelings when you found out about this, but at the time it was to us it was like an early version of what would later be called memes. You know what I mean? Like, we understood that these, and maybe it was because of the the grammar, the way that it was said was kind of this funny, like, English as a second language malapropism. But it was obvious that these guys were trying to be, instigators or provocative or, whatever. But it does, I think, underscore or I guess every metal genre wants to counter-identify against whatever's popular at the time. And death metal was popular, American death metal, Florida death metal. And Scott kind of became the symbol of that, the figurehead for that, at least for these Norwegian guys. No,
listen, he's a genius. I mean, I thought he was a dick at the time, but it's because I'm just being honest, right? I mean, at the time I thought, oh, this is a guy, because listen, I told David, and I'll say you, look, the black metal guys, I thought they looked cool. They couldn't play for shit compared to the American guys. Sorry, you guys. And I mean, I still say that to this day, and God bless you all, or whatever. Not God bless, because I'm an atheist. But I'm just saying that fucking, but I thought, anyway, well, I don't know if some of this is, they were,
well,
they had a good, listen, they had a good thing going, right? But at the same time this is the whole thing between us, and maybe we were snobby, going back to our conversation about being technical and being able to play good, right? They couldn't play as fast. They couldn't blast as good. They looked cool as shit, right? But I mean, in my opinion, it took a long time for bands to get better than the bands I recorded. Like, nowadays, the bands are sick playing. Like, let's take, I'll just use a simple example, and I'm not very good because I don't listen to cattle decapitation. Those guys are fucking sick players, right? They're crazy players, right? And that's the next wave generation. All these, and there's a million other bands. I'm not trying to say they're the only ones. There's a million of them. A lot of these bands that I listen to every now and then. I don't listen a lot. Fair transparency. But They're played better. But back in the days, that was the whole thing to me is what we're focusing on. I think the guy was smart for what he said is because it did become, I come from a punk rock background. We became the mainstream to a certain, my bands are going to disagree with me and say whatever it is, but Dan Seagrave, Scott Burns, Morrisound, Roadrunner, right? It became a formula, a package. Give him
$5,000. That's all it took, right?
That's right. So, but anyway, to the Mayhem guys, I have no disrespect to you. I think you hit the nail on the head for certain things. So, and to the black metal guys, it's all good. But I think there's a point to be taken from the whole thing that's you know what I mean? Because as David said, or you said, is that there was a point where death metal wasn't really cool at all. Agreed?
Yeah, but by the mid '90s, it was very unhip, and especially if you looked, Scott brings up a very good point. At the black metal bands just looked really cool, right? And then certainly not to say this is good or anything, but then you had the whole murders and church burnings behind them, and then you see pictures of death at the storage shed rehearsal facility wearing their sweatpants and odd looking shorts and things like that, and they look about as unmetal as can be, and yet here's Euronymous and Varg cloaked in black and wearing their gauntlets and everything, and they just looked really cool. But to Scott's point, and Scott, I think this may have ended up in the book, as Scott always said, is like would have liked to have brought some of those guys over to Morrisound and put them under the microscope and have them play and compare them to someone like Rob Barrett from Cannibal and Solstice and Malevolent and see who would stack up. And Scott,
any of these guys.
Yeah.
I mean, because it's easy to hide behind bad production and just looking brutal. And I mean, listen, to some people, that's all that matters, right? The look is important. But going back to earlier, what we said is it was important for us at the time. All the guys, I mean, if you go way back to the Tampa scene everybody used to show up at the fucking little shows, at the shows. And I don't mean to say little, but in other words, they weren't big shows, but they were local shows, right? 300 people, 200 people, whatever. They would sit there and watch everybody playing to see who could play. Everybody would talk shit. We would all talk shit about, who could play, who couldn't play.
Who was cheating.
It was important to see who could play and who was cheating, right? But in the big scheme of things, maybe it doesn't matter. But like I said, it's all good.
Yeah. Well, it dawned on me as I was reading the book that Scott has all the tea on who actually needed their drums to be edited, who needed the most takes to lay down their guitar tracks. You know what I mean? And so for the people who contributed to the book, they're all very very complimentary towards Scott. But I think for the people who didn't want to be contacted or didn't want to be involved with the book, I think they may know that Scott knows about them. Do you know what I mean? And may have been a little bit nervous about.
Yeah, I'll give Scott a lot of credit here. There really wasn't anyone that Scott threw under the bus in the book and said this dude sucks and we had to fix his stuff. And Scott knows who those people are, and assuredly Scott didn't tell me who those people were, and I probably wouldn't have put it in the book anyway. But Scott is a class act, and I think the furthest we went, it was probably the Hoffman brothers of Deicide, who, in Scott's defense, were a pain in the ass all the time towards Scott because they could never figure out their guitar tone. And I think Scott at some point would get so fed up during their recordings that he would leave their flubs in, but that's not to say they couldn't play. They just weren't as tight of players as the Cannibal guys, let alone they couldn't figure out what their guitar sound was. But yeah, I mean, we had a few people just out and out say they didn't want to be part of the book. I think the most noticeable one was Paul Speckman of Master,
right,
who thinks Scott was only in it for the money, which is hilarious. And Scott can definitely chime in and say how little money he made over the course of his Morrisound recording career. But no, for the most part, as Scott was really kind about not saying a drummer XYZ couldn't play his parts, so we had to boot him or guitarist. I don't think that would have been in good form, so we didn't go that route.
Yeah, and listen, I mean, the other thing is, it's not so much that any. Well said, David. Agreed. Everything you say. But I mean, the whole point, Adrian, I will say this is that it's not that. Listen, everybody needs help. I needed help. Nobody's perfect, right? I mean, at the time, Tom would help me. You know, I guess the point is like if you just don't if you don't want to try and look, because when you're in the studio, you're naked, right? You can sit there and you can play in your rehearsal hall and everything's loud and it sounds heavy as balls, heavy as shit, and you think it's killer and all that, right? But you're in a 10 by 10 room or a 20 by 20 room, and everybody's amps blaring and the drums and all that. I mean, and you love your song, it's great. But when you get in the studio, you really hear yourself without any clothes on, right? You hear your guitar tone, you hear your drum sound or whatever. And the one thing, to switch gears a second, that's the one thing that's different today is it's like all these guys, they all know the drill. They all have plugins. They all have been playing. They're all killer, right? I mean, but back in the day is no one knew how to play 200 miles an hour and make it sound good, right? As I told David everything sounded like you were in a fucking blender, right? It's like you put your smoothie, all your frozen vegetables or whatever you put it in, you start on your blender, right? Everybody wants to hear clarity out of everything when it's 200 miles an hour. And so if anything, back in the day, it was a little bit of a shock for everybody and me to try and say, hey, look, and I guess the point is I'll say is this, is the good bands, the bands that really cared would say to each other, hey man, you're down picking everything. You're up and down picking the stuff, right? We're playing the same riff. We should both down pick everything, right? Or things like that is. And so they would work on those things to make it sound tighter. I mean, you mentioned the Black Album. Let's go to Metallica, right? Okay, so those guys aren't fast at all. They're the biggest band ever in history. But they, and I know probably because James played everything, but they sounded tight on a record. So it's the guys that wanted to, like David mentioned, like with Cannibal and stuff with Rob Barrett, and Jack and things like that. And other bands, there's other bands we can say is that would say to each other like, hey, dude, look, you're playing it this way. Let's both play it this way. Or let's figure out how we want to play it. That's what made those bands great, right? Besides writing great songs is they would sit and talk about things and they would not just blow it off. Like he mentioned, unfortunately, like with the Hoffmans, and look, Brian and Eric were good guys, but they just kind of wanted to come in and just say, fuck it, let's let it ride, right? Let's play, and that's it, and that's the way it is. And that, I think, is the beauty of some of the bands that I recorded back in the day was a lot of them would like to would say is, hey, you know what I mean? Let's figure out how to play it, or let's play the same thing to make it sound better. Anyway, that's it.
the band is in the rehearsal studio. They sound like a tin can was dropped in a blender. How do you take that band and then find the clarity, find the precision? How do you make that sound listenable for someone like me?
Well, Scott, probably a good example would be Suffocation, right? When they came in for Effigy,
Absolutely. I mean,
right? Doug Cerrito and Terrence, they're a prime example of what, Adrian, you'd mentioned, and Scott was saying, of a band who had a rehearsal room playing at full volume and could never hear each other. Terrence told me, like, Doug and I never knew what we were playing, and they showed up for Effigy, and Scott, right, Scott, you didn't like their heads, you didn't like their cabinets, so you got those fixed up, and thankfully those guys were tight players. But I think when it came to their leads, they weren't tight players, so you sent them back to the hotel, right? You had to send a lot of guys home, or excuse me, back to the hotel to get their stuff together for the next day.
yes, but I mean, just that's true, David. But I mean, just for clarity for everybody, it's not like you sent anyone, to make it sound like I'm a hard ass.
Right. It's not like, it's not like you kicked anybody out of the studio. You
just mentioned this, but with Doug and Terrence, you have a good thing. Listen, Terrence is one of the greatest guitarists ever. No one can deny how good he is and how his right hand is so good. Or his left-handed, I forget, whatever, but it's down picking. But like you mentioned on Effigy, I remember him and Cerrito saying, Doug saying, dude, your sound always was shit in the studio. And, I hope Terrence doesn't take offense to this, but it's hard in a 10 by 10 studio. And so there are a few bands there are some bands that have a great sound, and obviously they're different. Like Trevor from Obituary, he's had that sound forever. He can plug in, he knows what he wants his sound to be like, and he does. And it's different for guys that you know what I mean, who just, once again, I think they're going back in the day, there was no, here, I'm going to switch gears. It's my Tiger Woods analogy, and I'm not a golfer, and I don't like golf and whatever. But when you used to watch golf, there were a bunch of fat old guys, and then all of a sudden this guy named Tiger Woods came around. He was athletic, and he just smoked everybody, right? It's like nowadays, all these guys, they've seen all these guys. They've got plugins. Death metal's been recorded. They're fat old guys like me that back in the day made things sound good. Now they've got technology, and now they make things smoking, right? Everything sounds good. But back in the day, it was difficult because you had no plugins. You had nothing. You were in some shitty little rehearsal hall. You were recording to a cassette recorder like Chuck used to do, these demos, right? I mean, all the guys, just demos, right? So you had no real clarity. Or like for Obituary, we recorded on an 8-track machine. It was hard to get a sound. But, and like I said, you couldn't dial up the Suffocation plug-in or the Testament plug-in or whatever, name your favorite band plug-in. You had to go out and get it on your own. And so that's what I think was difficult back in the day. And, and so we tried very hard to do it. And the bands that were more open to it and saying is like coming in and saying is like, well, yeah, my sound doesn't sound like that. You know what I mean? Or trying to figure out what sounds good, those bands did better, or perhaps, I'm not saying they did better, but maybe their sound was better. But today it's almost a non-starter because everybody has plugins.
And, something that you brought up in the book a few times is that a guitarist or, a performer would be really set on a guitar tone, but his guitar tone would only sound good in isolation. And, in the mix against all the other instruments, it would sound thin, it would sound weak, and, there are a few times in the book you talk about, it's like, all right, this is, basically, this is what you want and this is what I want. And you would A and B it and let them decide which they thought was better. And I think for the most part you won, right?
Well, I don't know if I won. I mean, I suppose is if you A and B things, everybody tends to have an opinion and whatever. And I think it goes back to Adrian is, and David brought it out, is that it's a different environment. In the studio, you're naked. You hear what it really sounds like in your rehearsal. We keep going back to it, but I mean, not to beat a dead horses, but in a rehearsal hall in a shitty little 10 by 10 room with parallel walls, with no sound stuff, I mean, you feel the vibe and you think it's heavy. But when you hear it, it's a different thing in a studio. And you can sit there and say, well, like in my room, it sounds good. But I mean, that's not really reality is. And so, it's not that I won, but at all, because listen, David brings up in the book, right? When we did Harmony Corruption, I sat in my truck with Mick, and he fucking hated the guitar sound that we got. He wanted it to sound like In Tune, right? So I mean, sometimes you win and sometimes you lose, right? I mean, like I said, I'm sorry, it doesn't sound like In Tune, right? Harmony Corruption, and so, but I think when you get a consensus of the band and the band sits there, because nothing I ever did was, listen, I'm not a producer really, right? I was more of an engineer, right? I was a little bit older, and like I said, is back to the pre-Tiger Woods analogy is I would just try and guide people from my experience with Jim, Tom, and Rick and all the bands that came to the studio, trying to say these are best practices. These are things, plus I think these, you know what I mean? But when you A/B stuff back and forth and the band, 3 out of the 5 guys say, I like it. If it just happens to be that the one guy who doesn't like it is the one guitarist, then you have to come to a group consensus. But, I don't know about winning and losing on it. Like I said, you just tried to do the best.
I was being a little bit facetious when I said that you won, but
that's cool. No, but I'm saying is nowadays I think it's much easier because you just do direct tracks and everybody uses a plug-in, and I mean everybody's got a plug-in sound, and you can pick anybody's sound, and that's a good thing.
I want to speak a little bit about the drum replacement techniques that you pioneered. So if I'm understanding the process correctly, a drummer would perform his parts, and he was using triggers, which created a MIDI file. Is that correct?
No, everybody sort of. Yes and no. Everybody just played live. I never really, besides like the Terrorizer, and that's only because it was an 8-track. I mean, typically I never triggered anything to tape into MIDI directly. We would play, and I didn't trigger as much snares as some other people at the studio. My primarily triggers were kick drums, because I always thought the snares sounded fake at the time, unless you needed help missing, like on blast beats and stuff. So typically, we would just play live. I mean, back to your question, Adrian, which is a great question. We would just play live, and then we would use a noise gate, which had a MIDI output, and we would feed that into Cakewalk. And from there, we would get the MIDI signal, and then we could take those signals, and then we could replace whatever MIDI input we had. And in my case, like I said, is a lot of times it was the kick drums were so fast that you didn't really need, I could just replace them, and we used the TC2290. But with snare drums, then you had to slide, like I said, is if you're doing snare drums, it was typically to fix mishits or stuff. So then you would slide them around we use the program Cakewalk and things like that. And then with the MIDI, it was a little nice, because if the guys didn't hit so hard, latency issues of it being slow between the delay, between the noise gate and all that. You could, like I said, with MIDI, you could move the note like milliseconds forwards. But in general, my stuff was mainly a lot of kick drum replacements and, not so much snare drum, but sometimes snare drums. And Super Brian, he was our guy at the studio. He was the expert, and he would do that.
And when we say, mostly kick drum replacement, I think it's worth noting that these were bands that were playing at 220 beats per minute. 16th note, double kick all the way through. So that's a lot of kick drum to replace.
Yes.
I mean, per song, like how long were you spending on drum replacement?
Well, it took more time than it does today, from what I'm told and from everybody. But yes, I mean, when the guys were really good, it was pretty quick. I mean, obviously, you have to play. I mean, to start with, you have to play through the song at least one time to try and get every kick drum hit. And when you miss stuff, you have to go back and punch in until you get them and adjust the noise gate and things like that. So, I mean, usually it would take like a few hours to a day for an album. You would set up the noise gate, you would play through the song, and hopefully most of the times you'd get almost everything. But if you didn't, then you'd have to punch in and keep going back until you got everything. And then, like I said, you could just, with the triggers, with the sounds, as you didn't care what it was, you could just put any sound in. But no, I guess I will say this is, it was, for the young kids out there that record, the fat old guy says, it took a lot longer than what you guys do.
I mean, so it sounds like the way you were able to find clarity for these productions came down to A, making sure that the performances were tight, and B, making sure that all the gear was top notch.
Absolutely. I mean, from what I learned, from day one, listen, I got hired at Morrisound and David documents it in the book, and so we'll go through it, but yes, as an assistant engineer. You had to start, like I said, you made sure that the drummer from Jim, Tom, and Rick, you put new heads on all the drums, right? The guy comes in and he's been playing on his kit for fucking 2 years and he's got tape on it and stuff, throw it out. It's just shit. It's never going to sound good. It's going to sound dead. So, because remember we tried to get 90% of our stuff was acoustic sounding. Today, I don't think anything is acoustic sounding, but that's a whole nother topic. So all the, we buy new drum heads for everything. And sometimes if the bands had money and depending on how many takes it takes, we would put new heads on for every song. But it depends on how long the drummer is going to take, right? If he's going to spend 3 days on a song or something like that, then you're definitely putting new heads on or whatever. With the guitars, new strings almost every song or whatever, especially bass players, because in other words, is those things, they tend to, or every couple songs or whatever they tend to go dead because they're playing fast and whatever, from sweat and things like that, they tend to sound duller and whatever. And tuning is important, like I said, but these are, nowadays all these guys, they all are experts at this. But in other words, it's like if you're a cook, right? I mean, you have to start with good ingredients to make things sound good to begin with. And that's it, because we tried to, in our world back in the day, most things were acoustic, they sounded natural or whatever. So you had to try and start off with a good kit. Like if the guy came in and he had some Vista Light Ludwig set that was shot, it's not going to sound that good. So, I mean, we were lucky. David talks about it in the book. We went to Thoroughbred Music, which was a huge music store that Tom was friends with, and Elliot passed away, bless his soul. He always took care of us. He would always give us top-notch equipment to use and stuff like that. And let us, all the amps we ever wanted to use, try anything, Mesa Boogie, Valve State, Marshall, whatever. And I just mean is you have to start with good equipment.
the title of the book is A Life in Death Metal, 1987 to 1997. Why 1997, Scott? What happens in 1997?
Go ahead, David. You can. I'll defer. To David.
Yeah, that was really when Scott had wanted to get out of recording as early as 1996. But there were a core group of bands that kept on calling upon him to record, namely Malevolent Creation, Suffocation, Deicide, and Sadist. Those are like the big four of the groups who still wanted to work with Scott, even though he let it be known that, hey, I'm not doing full-time work at Morris Sound. I can only record on evenings or weekends. I will not accommodate your schedule. You have to accommodate mine, is basically what the deal was. But those bands liked and respected Scott so much that they were willing to adhere to that schedule. And so, Scott at that point was looking to start a family and looking to do new things with his wife, and had, this is in the Obituary book, and this is also in Scott's book. John Tardy gifted him with a computer back in 1994, which started Scott's love affair with computers, which still exists to this day because Scott's a computer engineer.
Yes, he did.
And so you can thank John Tardy from Obituary for all of that. But Scott learned C++ programming and got a job at his wife's company at the time in 1996, and was doing that part-time as in addition to More Sound. And I think Suffocation were the last band that Scott did of that era, and then that was it. He sort of rode off into the sunset. No big announcements were made. This was still 1997. The internet was around, but it really wasn't a big thing like that. And granted, Scott probably wouldn't have been that guy anyway today to do something like that. But 1997 seemed like a fitting end to the book. And there are a few chapters after that. Scott did the occasional recording. He helped out his friend Walt's band in 2004, who are called The Last Great Hope. More recently, and this has been very well documented, he helped Kelly Schaefer from Atheist with his new band, Tilt the Dirt, with the production of their new album. And Scott, I guess, made his big, I don't know if you want to call it his public appearance. Scott, please correct me wrong. Scott goes to shows. He's out and about. And there's plenty of pictures of him at shows over the last few years. But the Chuck tribute shows in 2021, which capped the 20th anniversary of his passing, was a really big deal because it had a lot of the old More Sound gang, and a lot of the bands that Chuck recorded and musicians that Scott worked with were there. So that seemed like a fitting end to the book. I think it all sort of goes back to Chuck in many ways, because out of all of Scott's clients, Chuck is probably the most influential. Without Chuck, who knows where death metal would have been. And I think Scott's relationship with Chuck may have been the most complex out of them all in the book. So it just seemed fitting to wrap on that note. It seems like a good way to end the book.
Yeah, well said.
And so I can chime in on this, because this is about when I came into this music. 94, 95, bands started moving away from being, fast, being technical, relying exclusively on blast. You started getting a lot of, groovier albums, like you guys talked about that Obituary album. Napalm, Carcass, Entombed also moved in that direction, even though, Scott, you didn't work with Napalm or Entombed or Carcass, but I'm sure you were noticing what was happening in the wider scene as far as bands changing their styles up. Roadrunner Records essentially just ditched most of their death metal roster. Earache started releasing more like, I don't even know what you'd call it, like industrial, whatever they were going through during the mid to late 90s. And, it seemed like, and of course, there was this thing happening in Scandinavia where there was this more melodic style of death metal, which became much more popular, and in some ways overshadowed a lot of the older bands. And so it seemed like there was this movement away from like the classic death metal sound. And as somebody who started with that sound but got into it maybe after its heyday, or maybe after like the tide started to turn, I felt like somebody who came to a party late and all the cool kids were gone, and the people who were left were already like, cleaning up the empties and turning on the lights and trying to get everyone else to go home. Do you know what I mean?
Sure.
Absolutely. No, there was no. There was a all scenes come Machine Head, right? I mean, David, you can help me out. You guys, right? They signed, groove metal stuff. I mean, look at Pantera. I mean, they were more groove metal. I mean, Machine Head. No, it definitely moved away, and that's cool. And I'll say this just quickly as a producer, right? There's only two ways you get signed as a producer engineer. Either the band thinks you did a record, their favorite record, or Monty Connor thinks you're cool, right? I
Yeah.
use and I love Monty, but I'm saying the record label, right? So there's two ways you get, you know what I mean? They either the record label tells you you're going to use this guy because we love this guy, or the head guy in the band says, I love this guy's record and I want to use him. And as you said, Adrian, you know, things come and go, and like I said, there's a period of time where death metal wasn't cool and stuff like that. And groove metal came in, Corn, Machine Head, all that. I mean, but once again, I'm going to end on this: is it's 2023 and death metal is alive and well. And I mean, there are huge bands, and I'm going to help me out. Who's the big Swedish band?
At the Gates or
The Viking.
oh, Amon Amarth?
Oh, Amon Amarth.
Yeah, look at those. That's death metal vocals. I mean,
Yeah.
that's King Diamond with death metal vocals, right? I mean, or they're fucking huge. There's a lot of bands, so death metal had an influence, and it just takes time. And every day has, every dog has its day. And I'm just lucky. I loved all those guys, and it was great.
I mean, I went through a lot of the things that you were talking about, Scott, where people thought death metal was shit and went out of their way to tell me every chance that they could that, Obituary sucked, Morbid Angel sucked, Entombed sucked. And, by like 95, 96, as these bands were breaking up or changing their sound, all the people who said that death metal wouldn't last and everyone would grow up and cut their hair, it kind of seemed like they were right for a while, right? And then, by 98, you had this second wave of death metal bands who were somehow even faster than the first wave. And, you had Nile coming out, you had Cryptopsy putting out a new album, you had these bands coming out from Brazil and Poland who were very much in that Morbid Angel style. And they say that history is written by the victors. I mean, for all the people who couldn't understand what Cynic was doing or couldn't understand what Suffocation was doing, like those two bands eventually like founded their own like sub genres of music. Like in the last 6 weeks, I've interviewed a bunch of bands who, one of whom went out of the way to say that Focus is their favorite album of all time. But like, I'm hearing a lot of fretless bass. I'm hearing a lot of like those, twangy, bendy riffs. And as far as like the haters and, the naysayers, like where are those magazines now? Like you can barely find a rock music magazine. You know what I mean? Most of the record companies are gone. It's like, it seems like the bands and the genres are the ones who survived.
Well, absolutely, Adrian. And look, you bring up Cynic, great band. I mean, they had a terrible go of it when they came out, right? Because just like atheists, like David mentioned in the beginning, they weren't pigeonholed. They didn't fit into that, right? And now, did people love them were there people that got them? Absolutely. But at the same time is now, they're considered classics. But back in the day, I mean, they had a rough go of it on their tours and stuff like that is. So, and you mentioned Suffocation. Mentioned to David. I remember a reviewer doing Effigy of the Forgotten saying the only way you can tell their songs is because there's spaces in between them on the record, right? I mean, now it's like it was classic then, it's classic now, but it's just that's life, and it is, and like I said, is look. I think what you brought up is a good point, Adrian. Cynic, Suffocation, all the good bands. I mean, some of them hopefully keep playing. They doing well now because they were great bands, and now people just consider it. I think that the important thing is, David and I talked about it. They just consider it metal now. There's not like fucking nobody sits and says, "Oh, it's fucking death metal" or "it's thrash metal." People just say, "Oh, whatever, it's metal or it's thrash." But I mean, there's no stigma attached to it, right? It's not like you're a fucking dickhead or you're uncool. You can't go to a party and say you like this style of music, right? I mean, maybe there's new styles, fat old guy, and whatever the people do that is, but there's no stigma with death metal anymore, and that's amazing.
Well stated, Scott.
I don't know how many times I've been at a house party or a gathering or something, wearing my Deicide shirt or my Suffocation shirt or whatever, and like some random guy will be like, Deicide, like this music has connected so many people, and sometimes people you wouldn't expect. I do want to ask one thing though, because on this podcast I ask a lot of questions about recording, and certain names keep coming up over and over and over again. There's a guy named Greg Wilkinson who's sometimes referred to as the Scott Burns of the Bay Area. Colin Marston handles a lot of productions for bands on the East Coast. Brad Boatwright is another guy whose name gets brought up a lot. These engineers, these producers are in a similar boat that you were in circa, 94, 95, where they're really associated with a certain scene or a certain sound, but that sound's not going to last forever. Do you have any advice for anyone who's an engineer currently or wants to get into it as far as longevity and making a career out of it?
Well, I suppose this is. You should always remember as an engineer that your job is the liaison between the artist and getting what they record on tape, right? So if you want to be somewhat successful, you have to have technical skills. There's no doubt about that. If your stuff sounds like shit, no one's going to hire you or whatever. But at the same time if you're a dickhead and no one likes you, then no one's going to they might record with you one time, but they probably won't record with you again. And I think the most important thing to take away from that, what I was trying to say, is that the guy should go away at the end of the day and said, I created a piece of art and I enjoyed it and I enjoyed working with that person. So having said that's something from a technical standpoint as an engineer. You got to be technical and you have to get along with people, and you know what I mean? So they're comfortable while you're sitting in the chair with them because it's their piece of art that you're trying to work with. As far as longevity, I will say this as a person of failed longevity, right? There was a time, and David talks about it in the book, where I didn't give a fuck, where I loved extreme music. I came from extreme background. I didn't want to fucking do anything else. And I thought, I don't care, right? I don't know if he talked about the Wild Hearts or whatever. There was some bigger bands or other bands that came out. I was stupid, and I was like, whatever, give a fuck. You either have to say, as an engineer, fuck it for the long road, which you know what I mean? I mean, there's going to come a day, like you're saying is with these guys, where they're not going to be cool. And then you have to wait out that 10-year period or whatever the period is. Because once again, only two people call you, either a kid in the band that loves an album that you did or the record label. So if you're not cool to the record label and the bands don't think you're cool, then you're stuck. So you either have to wait out the longevity or you have to diversify and do other bands. So I don't know but I would just, like I said, to me that's the thing is for having a long career. But the most important thing I would say is be happy as an engineer and consider yourself lucky. If you get a chance to record great bands, you've done a good job.
I mean, as far as the longevity goes, your longevity, I think you're being extremely modest. I am also an old fat guy who's, maybe stuck around this music longer than I should have. And a lot of the bands that I speak to on this podcast are quite literally young enough to be my kids. But, the bands that they talk about and the albums that they talk about are the albums that I grew up on, So Death, Suffocation, Morbid Angel, Old Sepultura. And I think, they're coming to your work, Scott, and your work has stood the test of time for 30 years. And so I don't think you should be so down on yourself for your longevity. I think it's easy to say something that's timeless, within our little scene. But the fact of the matter is, like, this stuff is more popular now than it was 91, 92 when it first came out.
Absolutely.
And people are discovering it every day.
No, absolutely, Adrian. Like I said, it's just metal now. It's not stigmatized that it's death metal, that like you're uncool. Like I said, the thrash guys thought the death metal guys were uncool. And I'm sorry to say that to my metal brethren back in the early 90s. Stigmatized, right? And now there isn't. Maybe there is. You guys are hit. David, Adrian, maybe you know us. Maybe there are people that are the same. I'm sure people are people. But it's just metal. And like I said, there's big bands that have brutal, heavy vocals and they sell millions of records, right? And and to end, like I said, is I'll just end it with this: is those guys wrote great albums. That's why they're still around. There's no, we can talk about Scott Burns, and I was lucky to record great bands, but they're still around 30 years later.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to sum it up, Scott.
There's no Scott Burns recording them 30 years later. They're doing it on their own. They deserve everything, the credit they get.
So, the Scott Burns Sessions, A Life in Death Metal, 1987 to 1997, will be released by Decibel Books. Scott, David, how can people order the book? What's the best way to get it?
Yeah, you should be able to get it through Decibel Magazine online via their Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, their main website, which I think is just decibelmag.com, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, that's the only place you can get it right now. I think they are working on some international editions, but nothing has been announced quite yet.
So, as we discussed, Scott is mostly a private citizen and doesn't use social media much. David, as for yourself, if people want to find the other books that you've written or any of your online work, what's the best way to find you?
Yeah, I just have a website, David E. Gehlke, at davidegehlke.com, I should say. My email address is really simple, davidegehlke@gmail.com. I'm not too wild about social media myself. I am on Facebook and a few other things, but I mainly use them to connect with people so I can conduct interviews about people like Scott Burns. So that's my extent of social media activity.
And if you're a band, want somebody to tell the real truth about you, you should hire David because he will he will go through and he will find out all the facts and vet them, and he will write all the truth, great stuff. And I mean, no one works harder than David. So thank you.
Well, it's easy when you have a subject like Scott Burns, so it's a pleasure.
And thanks, Adrian.
Metal Brothers, let it flow.
Join me, slowly we rise.